What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so really for the last few months or so, we've been kind of goofing off when it came to DC Rebirth, and a lot of that's because of the fact that we've been doing like Dark Knight's Metal, and we've been doing like Watchmen, different things like that, but we are behind. Like, we are so behind on DC Rebirth. It is pitiful. So over the course of the next few weeks or so, we're gonna play catch up. Like, we're doing a huge DC Rebirth dump, and we're starting this all off with Red Hood and the Outlaws. Now, to get us caught up here, for those of you guys who saw the first Red Hood and the Outlaws video and haven't really read it since, Red Hood and the Outlaws in DC Rebirth is like this natural progression of Jason Todd's character. Even taking out of the equation things like reboots, it's like, pretend New 52 never happened. Jason Todd was a pre-Crisis character. He showed up before Crisis on Infinite Earths. His origin story was just like Dick Grayson. Fans hated it. DC tried to give him a new origin. Fans still didn't like it. And so at the request of the fan base, DC killed him off. They replaced him with Tim Drake, several years later. Jason Todd came back after the events of Infinite Crisis. He became the Red Hood, and fans loved it because it gave him direction. He was kind of this outlier character who was just sort of out there. He was part of the Bat family, but at the same time, he wasn't part of the Bat family. He was willing to be a lot more brutal than Batman was. This ran all the way up until the New 52. DC paired him up with Arsenal, and it was interesting for a while, but people were wanting more of like the dark and brooding Jason Todd. They weren't really shooting for like the buddy cop story. And it was interesting, for the time that we had it, but DC Rebirth sets Jason Todd back to rights. That was the whole basis of Red Hood and the Outlaws. It was, let's set Jason Todd back to the kind of character that fans are most familiar with, and then let's keep him there for a little while. And so with Scott Lobdell writing the story, the nature of Jason Todd in DC Rebirth really fit in nicely with the whole Red Hood concept, in the sense that he was basically tasked by Batman with finding some connection between some criminal element and a mayor, and then ultimately it turned out the mayor was infected with a virus, and then Jason Todd pretended to assassinate the mayor in order to cure him, and then basically look like the mayor was dead, and then give himself away into the criminal underworld. It was one of these things where Jason Todd was willing to do some pretty seedy things, or at least what looked to be some pretty seedy things, in order to achieve his goal. He was starkly different from Bruce Wayne. Now, the introduction of other characters like Artemis, like Bizarro, those were really just kind of like happenstance, right? It's just one of those things where their paths just kind of crossed. Artemis was on the hunt for the bow of Ra, which we'll explain in this video. Bizarro had been created by Lex Luthor back when he was still a bad guy in order to find a way to defeat Superman. I mean, these characters have just kind of been thrown out there, and by virtue of just great writing, they crossed over into the path of Jason Todd, and they formed the Dark Trinity, Red Hood, Artemis, and Bizarro, and they've basically been a team ever since. And the storytelling in this is fantastic, in that the way this kicks off is it really focuses on the state of Qurac. Now, this brings into sharp relief the idea of Artemis in terms of who she is and what she's about, because what this does is basically it sees kind of the return of a woman by the name of Akila. Now, this begins to do things like bring in some history of the nature of DC Rebirth. So as we know, and as we've talked about before, DC Rebirth is designed to grab themes that existed before DC rebooted with the New 52 and roll them into, DC at the moment. And when it came to the character of Artemis, she's not new. In fact, she's been around since Wonder Woman number 90 in 1994. And the whole idea behind this was to begin introducing themes that could bolster Wonder Woman's popularity. Remember, George Perez's creation of Bana Migdal, I think is how you pronounce it, back in 1989, 1990, something like that. It was designed for the purpose of basically saying there's more Amazons out there than what you see in Themyscira. There's more than just Wonder Woman. It's like when Jeff Johns grabbed the Green Lanterns and said there's actually more Lantern Corps than just the Green Lanterns and the Yellow Lanterns. There's a lot going on out there. And the whole basis behind this was to, again, bolster the Wonder Woman landscape, bolster those stories. Bana Migdal is basically this land of Amazons that basically broke off from Themyscira thousands of years beforehand and took up residence in Egypt. Now, the cool thing about this is that it also saw crossovers. It saw, it really kind of established this animosity between these two tribes. The fact they didn't really see eye to eye. You had the Bana Migdal Amazons, and then you had the Themysciran Amazons. And that was really about it. I mean, that was, you didn't have a whole lot going on there. And so DC grabbing those concepts and rolling them in, seeing the return of Akila and the return of the concept of the Shimtar, I think is how you pronounce it, is sort of this return to familiarity for a lot of people who have been reading Wonder Woman comics for years. Now, again, the phrase Skimtar or Shimtar, however you want to pronounce it, is really designed to just kind of be the champion of the people. It's kind of like the Bana Migdal version of Wonder Woman, which is to say, where Wonder Woman was really more of a exploratory character, being that, Diana just kind of left Themyscira, went into her own thing. For For Artemis, it's really more of a tangible thing, in the sense that it's not an idealistic superhero, it's the actual champion of their people. Now, at the outset, what this does is it grabs this idea that there's something called the Bow of Ra, and the Bow of Ra is really like the most powerful weapon that the Bottom Migdal have at their disposal. And the idea was that only a select person can use it, basically the Shim'tar of the Bottom Migdal. Initially, Artemis thought it was her, and that was an on-running theme back in the older days of Wonder Woman, back in the George Perez stories and different things like that. It was the idea that Artemis was the Shim'tar. She was the protector of the Bottom Migdal people. With regards to DC Rebirth, it sort of modifies that a little bit, and it simply says that Akila was the Shim'tar, and Akila was the only person who could really wield the Bow of Ra. The problem with this was that because she wasn't really ready for it, ultimately the bow got the better of her. And so because of the fact that the Bottom Migdal took up residence in Qurac, and they were constantly trying to be pushed out by, whatever dictator was running the show at the time, ultimately Akila was corrupted by the bow, and she started using the bow to basically wipe out her own kingdom, as well as try to take out those Quracis. And the result was that Wonder Woman showed up, eventually talked to Artemis into an ally of sorts, and then ultimately they took out Akila, or at least it was believed that she was basically dead. And so this is the whole basis behind it, because during that conflict, the Bow of Ra had vanished, and that's what set Artemis on this trail, resulting in her meeting up with Red Hood and then basically becoming part of the Dark Trinity. And so of course, the fact that they're being brought to Qurac, the fact that, we basically have, Red Hood and Artemis and Bizarro looking for the Bow of Ra in order to assist Artemis in her mission, this of course brings Bizarro in, who basically lays waste to everybody. Now again, the funny thing about this is that because of the fact that Bizarro was designed to kind of be this clone of Superman, albeit with broken English, it works. It works pretty well, because we look at his character and the idea is that he's doing what he thinks is right. He's doing what he believes to be the right thing. The issue with this is that somebody fires the Bow of Ra, or at least some kind of an explosion goes off, and everybody's just kind of separated and split off into different locations. Now again, that's the nature of this whole idea of Red Hood and the Outlaws, because of the fact that this story took place by like the 8th or 9th issue in the run. What it basically meant is that it was the goal of Scott Lobdell to build the characters individually as well as focus on them as a team. And that's just kind of a hallmark to all the years that Scott Lobdell's been writing comics. He's well aware on how to build characters, and that's the nature of it, is to build up the individuals to give you a reason to care about them, so that when you have a team book that comes together, you're vested in each of the individual characters and you're essentially rooting for the team to succeed. And so of course with Bizarro basically crash landing in Qurac proper, which is to say surrounded by all these different citizenry, they think he's Superman. And so of course in their mind it is, well, Superman's a protector of the people, not just, the metropolis, but the world. And so he can help us out of this. He can get rid of this dictator for us or something along those lines. Now, because of the fact that Bizarro is trying to be a good guy, his response is, I'll protect you as best I can, and I'll make sure that you guys are safe from the general's forces. Now, from here it switches over to Jason Todd, and this is one of the most important aspects of his writing, because he's taken prisoner near the exact same building he was killed in. And that's why this is so cool, is because this sort of brings back, for those individuals who basically picked up Red Hood and the Outlaws with DC Rebirth, and they never read anything about Jason Todd before, this covers all that. It talks about how DC wanted to get rid of Jason Todd because fans didn't like him. They basically told a story where Jason believed he tracked down his birth mother. This eventually led to Qurac. The Joker showed up, ambushed him, beat him with a crowbar, and then blew him and his mom up. And then Jason Todd was dead. These are the things that basically feed into this whole concept. But with regard to Jason Todd himself, it's him kind of facing his own past. And that's the importance of it, is because it's one of those things he didn't necessarily deal with. To a degree he did, but only insofar as the writing allowed it when he originally came back. Building an animosity between Red Hood and Batman was limited to, why didn't you avenge my death after the Joker killed me? And then that was really about it. This kind of deep character exploration didn't really happen. Not only that, picking back up with Artemis, we end up finding out that Akila is still alive. And so again, maybe it's Akila. I'm not 100% sure how you would pronounce that, but the fact remains here that it is interesting to me, because this goes into the nature of Artemis. With Artemis as a character sitting down, basically having been someone who had to kill her own sister, because remember, despite the fact that the Bottom Migdal Amazons do not hail from Themyscira, they're still extremely tight-knit. They're our sisters. We have to protect them at all costs. They're still very, very close to each other. Not only that, where Artemis and Akila, at least Akila, as far as I recall, in the pre-New 52 landscape back during the 90s, where they were extremely close friends, Scott Lobdell teases the idea that they were actually romantically involved. These moments, this kind of a scenario when Jason Todd sits inside of his own mind, switching back to his character, and he's reliving and watching his own death at the hands of the Joker, this, younger version of himself, is basically saying, you gotta help me, you gotta save me. And Jason Todd's response is, there's no way to save you, because I already died. This already happened. This happened years ago, and this is all just playing out in my mind. Now, of course, he does end up taking out the Joker, and he does end up, essentially killing him and saving young Jason Todd, but this is his own mind's way of dealing with his own history and conquering his own fears. And that's the important thing about this. Because of the fact that Joker had killed Jason Todd during the Death in the Family storyline, the whole idea was that it was always a part of his character, and it was something he never fully dealt with. This coming in and being written by Scott Lobdell is basically saying, we're finally putting this to bed. And that's what Scott Lobdell's doing. He's basically saying, there's more to Jason Todd than the fact that he was killed by the Joker and brought back using a Lazarus pit. So let's explore what that is. Let's find out what that is, and let's just see where that road takes us. This ultimately leads to essentially Akila bringing back this whole story and basically saying, look, when you and Wonder Woman fought me and you guys were forced to kill me, ultimately I was basically brought back by the General. The General took the Bow of Ra, or at least bought it off of Black Mask. Ultimately, the General brought me back because of the fact that the General couldn't wield it. He wasn't able to use it. And so his idea was to basically clone me, so to speak, bring me back, and then turn me into his own weapon. Now, the cool thing about this is that the way this plays out, it's just kind of one of those things where it's like, but I mean, you know, we never really knew what road this would take us in, and I was never really sure what would happen, but what I do know is that our people are back. We want you back here, Artemis. And that's a very important thing for her character, because she's basically been on this journey and has actually left Bonnie McDowell and gone on this whole quest to find the Bow of Ra. The idea is that she's grown beyond the bounds of the home she came from. And so because of that, she's almost a torn loyalty to Red Hood and to Bizarro, whereas she also has this drive to return back to the life that she had before. Well, there's no more tracking down bad guys, living your life in a simple way in some hidden Egyptian town. It really kind of tugs on the heartstrings of what it means to be a sentient being. Now, of course, this leads directly into the whole idea of Red Hood eventually escaping his captives, you know, being confronted by the General, taking out the General's forces, and of course, putting a gun to the General himself. But the question is, what's going on and where is the Bow of Ra? The General's response is, I had it, but I don't have it anymore because it was stolen from me. And that's when we end up finding out that Akila still has the Bow of Ra. Not only that, she's still corrupted by the power she possesses. So it's really, really cool because it basically builds on this idea that there is no going back. There's no way to return to the life that you came from. Red Hood showing up alongside the General, you end up having Akila and the various forces alongside Artemis, who essentially show up and they're like, we have to take these guys out. These guys are constantly trying to tear down the society we live in. They're constantly trying to push us out. They're trying to steal our home. It is really intriguing because the initial response of Red Hood is, yeah, but Akila is the one that has the Bow of Ra, and she's the one who's still corrupted. Now, Artemis' desire to return home to a life of simplicity almost trumps the idea of Red Hood. And that's the nature of these relationships. That's why it's so cool, is because if this were just a general superhero story, let's say, for example, this story was written in the 1950s, one, it wouldn't be anywhere near that dark, and two, Artemis would have been like, oh, Akila has the Bow of Ra, well then let's get her instead. Instead, you know, with the way comics have progressed over the decades, the whole idea behind this is characters become more tangible and they become more grounded. And so Artemis' response is exactly the way ours would be. Well, that's not true. No way she has that bow, because if she has the bow, it means she's still corrupted, which means that even if she came back, it's a core part of her character now, meaning that my friend and presumably former lover can never return to a state of normalcy. She can never go back to being a good guy again. And if she can never go back, I can never go back, which means I'm stuck in this life now. It hits in the nature of people. And so effectively, the life of Artemis to a degree is brought full circle. It's brought right back around again, because it's this idea that now Artemis has to be the one to take out her friend. And so of course, this leads directly into, you know, of course, Bizarro showing up alongside all these other guys, you know, and of course, Akila tries to take on Bizarro as best she can. Ultimately, it's not the best decision one could make. She's able to pull it off to a degree, but her massive use of this weapon really impacts Bizarro because it almost seems like it kills him. Now, of course, this leads directly into like Red Hood and these guys, you know, Artemis, so on and so forth, them being able to take out Akila just by virtue of the fact that Artemis takes the Bow of Ra. And what this does is it establishes her as being the Shimtar. And this simply means that she is supposed to be that person, that she is destined to be the protector of her people. It's basically continuing to kind of build these themes and the future of where the story may lead and what may end up happening. The problem with all this is that by virtue of, you know, Bizarro being hit by this Bow of Ra, the massive surge of energy, it effectively seems like it's going to kill his character. Now, this allows us to cover a little bit of the history when it comes to the character of Bizarro. I mean, he is really interesting, and maybe we could get away with doing like a character explanation video on him, but he's been around since Superboy number 68 in 1958, and he was created by Otto Bender, I think it was. And again, that was all really back in the day when you basically had, you know, Mort Weisinger running the show, and he was like, something new every 6 months. Don't care what it is. It needs to be Superman related. It needs to obviously be a version of Superman or something called Super, and it has to be introduced every 6 months. So the cool thing about Bizarro is that over the years, from the time he was first introduced all the way up to the modern day, he's always been depicted as just kind of a dumbed down version of Superman. Now, a lot of things have been expanded. You've had Bizarro World. You've even had Bizarro Batman. You've had all these things that have gone on with this character as time has progressed. But the kind of development that you're seeing with him now is actually new for the most part, focusing on this idea that Bizarro was a version of Superman created by Lex Luthor to destroy Superman. You know, the idea that Bizarro's kind of being reworked and revamped. This kind of rewriting that's going on here is actually pretty significant and it's pretty huge. I mean, there have been writers who have touched on things like this, but not quite like this. And that's what makes this so intriguing, is because Artemis and Red Hood genuinely care about Bizarro. For these guys, they're cast-offs in a lot of ways. That's why Bizarro fits in so well. These characters are, in a lot of ways, cast-outs. And so with Bizarro just kind of being this twisted clone of Superman, these three have effectively formed a family for themselves. They're building that relationship, they're building that friendship, and they're kind of at a point where they don't want to lose these other guys. And so because of this, Bizarro systematically being shut down coincides with the return of Solomon Grundy. Now, Solomon Grundy is an interesting talking point when it comes to DC Comics. A lot of people will say the Incredible Hulk is a copy of Solomon Grundy. Solomon Grundy did appear before the Incredible Hulk, but it wasn't until the Incredible Hulk appeared that Solomon Grundy was revamped into his current form. Hulk was so popular that DC kind of took that concept and rolled it into Solomon Grundy. It is kind of interesting with that, but for the most part, Red Hood and Artemis stand no chance against Solomon Grundy. I mean, you're talking about a guy who, one, is effectively immortal, and two, even Superman will struggle with. And so it's one of these things where it's like, okay, look, they can do the best they can, but at this point, they're a stopgap measure, and they're a very short stopgap measure because Solomon Grundy would waste these guys in almost no time at all. Now, with Bizarro, suffering from cellular degeneration, he kind of ignores that, flies into the scene, incapacitate him, and call it a day. Basically, send Solomon Grundy out, send him on his way, beat him unconscious, and leave him there. But the problem with this is that as he's been doing this, he's been exerting all this energy and effectively is quote unquote dying. Now, it's one of the saddest moments in the world because he tells Red Hood, he was like, keep an eye on Pup. It's the funniest thing. It's funny and it's sad and it's adorable. It's very childlike in terms of how this works. It's one of the reasons why I dig this so much. But ultimately, the quote unquote death of Bizarro is really, kind of halted. He receives this kind of stay of execution at the hands of Lex Luthor. Now remember, because of the fact that the early days of the New 52 saw Lex Luthor basically being a bad guy, trying to find ways to take out Superman, and then creating Bizarro for that purpose, with the event of Forever Evil basically seeing the crime syndicate, the evil version of the Justice League, invading the main DC universe due to the fact that Anti-Monitor was wiping out their reality, wiping out realities left and right. This forced Lex Luthor to make his own Justice League team in order to save the world. And because of the fact that he had become a hero, it changed his character. It was DC basically saying, so what if Lex Luthor became a good guy and then stayed a good guy? And that's why you're seeing Lex Luthor the way you are right now in DC Rebirth. But because of the fact that he's the one that created Bizarro, he's the best person suited to fix Bizarro. And that's exactly how this plays out. You end up having Artemis and Red Hood recollect on their experiences with Bizarro. Jason Todd playing video games with him. I have no idea what video game they would play together, but it looks fun. It's almost like one of these movie montage scenes, where a person looks back on all the greatest moments of their lives with a friend they're about to lose. But because of the fact that Bizarro is designed to be this sort of opposite of Superman, the question of Lex Luthor is, if green kryptonite in the veins of Superman would kill him, what will it do to you? Now, this kind of stretches the bits of credulity, and it's really kind of Scott Lobdell saying, hey guys, just go with it. Just don't question it too much. Just sort of run with it, and let's just see what happens. And so where green kryptonite would normally kill Superman, and Lex Luthor says, well, you're the opposite of Superman, so if green kryptonite would kill Superman, then it'll heal you. Let's inject it and let's just see what happens. And ultimately, it's interesting because Lex Luthor comes back out after this quote unquote surgical work. Red Hood and Artemis go in. Not only is Bizarro healed, Bizarro is now a genius. He's exactly what it seems like he was meant to be. Super smart, higher level reasoning. It's crazy. He's the opposite of Bizarro now, but he's not Superman. So what does that make him? I have no idea. I have no idea what the answer to that question is. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.